"Who's firing?" The voice tore through the radio, sharp and confused. Static answered back, "Just the wind, just sand." Lieutenant Corian scanned the dunes through his scope, jaw clenched, heartbeat quickening under the relentless desert sun. Nothing moved. Nothing but heat waves bending the horizon into a trembling mirage. And yet, someone had just taken the shot. Not a random round, not an accident. A clean, deliberate trigger squeezed from somewhere inside their perimeter. He cursed under his breath and keyed his mic again. "Talk to me. Who fired that round?" Silence, then another voice uncertain. "Sir, we got nothing. All shooters accounted for." A pause, then the lieutenant's tone dropped, quieter but colder. "Then who the hell just took that shot?" 30 meters behind their command post, a pair of eyes opened beneath the sand. Sergeant Kira Westland lay still, her breath shallow, the barrel of her rifle half buried under desert netting. For 11 hours she hadn't moved, except to blink. The sand had molded to her like a second skin. The only sound was her heartbeat echoing inside her chest. When she finally rose, slowly, deliberately, like something born from the desert itself, the men staring toward the dunes froze in disbelief. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one was. And yet there she stood, covered in grit, wrapped in camouflage, the ghost they'd been trying to find for half a day. No words were needed. Their faces said it all. But that moment, the look of shock, the unspoken respect, the way silence spread like a wave, wasn't about pride for her. It was relief. Not the relief of victory, but the quiet exhale of someone who'd spent years proving she belonged. She'd done this before, too many times. 2 months earlier, when her orders came through assigning her to the Naval Special Warfare Training Center near Yuma, Arizona, Kira had felt something close to resentment. It wasn't the mission. It was the idea of walking into another room full of men who'd already decided who she was before she said a word. She knew that look. She'd seen it in Iraq, Afghanistan, at every checkpoint and briefing table in between. The polite nods, the subtle dismissals, the quick assumptions. Too small, too quiet, too female. They didn't know that silence was her strength. At 27, she'd spent nearly a third of her life learning how to disappear. Not just physically, but emotionally. How to bury frustration beneath focus, fear beneath precision. The kind of control that takes years of pain to master. Her uncle, a Vietnam recon Marine, had taught her that when she was still a teenager on the ranch in New Mexico. Back then, it wasn't about war. It was about survival, keeping cattle alive through droughts, fixing fences in dust storms, tracking coyotes by the faint lines they left in the sand. He taught her how to read the land the way most people read faces. "See where the wind bends the grass? That's a story," he'd say. "See where birds circle at dawn? That's where water hides." By 14, she could follow a trail invisible to most adults. By 16, she could tell what kind of animal had passed by just from the depth of a print. Those lessons, the patience, the stillness, the rhythm of breathing with the earth, stayed with her long after he was gone. When he died and left her the ranch she couldn't afford, she joined the army out of desperation. But what began as escape became purpose. The recruiter in Albuquerque had said, "The army needs people who understand terrain." He didn't know how right he was. At Fort Benning, the instructors noticed her first during night navigation drills. Others stumbled, she glided. Where others made noise, she made none. She didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't second guess. By graduation, they'd pushed her toward the scout program, an elite track for soldiers who could survive unseen, move behind enemy lines, and observe without being detected. Her first deployment came fast. Iraq, Anbar Province, heat that made your thoughts slow down. She learned quickly that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. 3 days in a hide site without movement, counting breaths between artillery echoes, waiting for a single moment that could change the course of a mission. She remembered one night vividly, her first real observation mission, a cluster of abandoned farmhouses 3 kilometers outside Fallujah. Intel said insurgents were using it as a staging point. Her team had set up in a ditch barely wide enough for 2 people. For 48 hours they waited. The wind shifted. Flies gathered. Sweat ran down her spine and dried before it reached her waistband. On the 3rd morning, as dawn bled into the sky, she spotted a man step out of a doorway. He stretched, smoked, and looked up toward her position, but never saw her. She had become the earth around her. When the airstrike came an hour later, she didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. That's when she realized something most people never do. Invisibility isn't about hiding. It's about belonging so completely that the world forgets you're separate from it. Now, years later, the desert of Arizona felt familiar. Same light, same silence, same fight for acknowledgement without ever asking for it. The Yuma training area was brutal, a basin surrounded by shifting dunes, where the horizon shimmered like glass by 9 in the morning. The kind of place that stripped away ego and left only endurance. That morning, the briefing room had been packed, 20 SEAL operators, all sunburned and sharp, plus a few senior instructors who looked like they'd seen everything twice. Commander Halstead, overseeing the sniper and reconnaissance program, laid out the parameters. 1 scout, 12 square kilometers of open terrain. SEAL platoon has 24 hours to locate and identify. Simple words, impossible task. Kira sat near the back, listening unnoticed, until Halstead added, "The scout will be Sergeant Kira Westland, U.S. Army." Silence, a long one. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel the skepticism radiating from the front row like heat from a barrel. A Lieutenant Corian leaned forward. "Sir, just to clarify, we're running SEAL doctrine against a single Army scout." Halstead nodded once. "Correct." The lieutenant's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Someone else didn't bother to hide his opinion. "Sir," said Senior Chief Driscoll, arms crossed, "no disrespect intended, but this is meant to evaluate SEAL tactics. If we can't find a single target in open desert, we've got bigger problems. Feels like we're lowering the bar here." The room chuckled lightly. Halstead didn't. "Understood, Senior Chief," he said evenly, "but the test stands." When the briefing ended, Kira walked out without a word. She didn't bother defending herself. She learned long ago that silence was a sharper weapon than pride. That night, she prepared her gear with the precision of ritual. Her ghillie system, desert-patterned, modified through 3 deployments, was laid out piece by piece. Every strand of netting had been adjusted to match local sand tones. Her M110A1 SDMR lay across the bunk, freshly cleaned, zeroed 2 days prior. She ran a fingertip along the receiver, checking for grit. Her hands didn't tremble. Packing was minimal. Water, energy bars, entrenching tools, small med kit. Nothing more. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Hair pulled tight, eyes colder than she remembered. The uniform made her look strong, but it wasn't the fabric that carried strength. It was the scars beneath it. She thought of her uncle again. The way he'd sit with his rifle across his knees, looking at the horizon as if listening to it breathe. "You can't beat the land, Kira," he'd told her once. "You can only understand it, and if you do, it'll hide you." She whispered those words to herself before dawn, before they dropped her off in the endless sand. Insertion happened at 400. 3 kilometers from the target zone. The only sound was the hum of the truck's engine, fading into distance. Alone, she crouched, watching faint stars dissolve into a pale horizon. Time was a luxury she wouldn't waste. She began moving slowly, deliberately, 1 step at a time. Her movements were almost meditative. The desert swallowed sound, swallowed presence. By sunrise, she had already found her position, a low ridge on the eastern slope, overlooking the valley where the SEALs would likely set their command post. She dug her hide by hand, 18 inches deep. shallow enough to maintain field of fire, deep enough to disappear. She used the small shovel like a surgeon, each movement deliberate. When the hole matched the natural contours of the dune, she lined it with mesh, layered her ghillie over top, and blended it with sand and sparse brush until even she couldn't tell where her hide began. Then she waited. Hours passed, the wind whispered, the sun burned, her throat went dry, she didn't move. Not when insects crawled across her sleeve, not when her legs began to cramp, not when sweat turned to salt on her skin. At 1600 hours they came. 20 men moving in staggered formations, professional, coordinated, disciplined. They swept the valley with precision, each movement drilled from years of training. She respected that, but she also knew patterns kill, and every man on that team moved by pattern. They cleared the low ground first, then advanced into the dunes. Twice they passed within 50 meters, once even closer. She could see the reflection of their optics flash in the sun. One of them muttered over comms, "Clear Sector 5, no contact." She almost smiled. The hours turned to night. The desert grew cold. Voices faded in and out through static. Frustration built in the tone of their leader. She could hear it even without the radio, men questioning their own certainty. By sunrise, they'd given up the search and regrouped. That's when she made her move. Slowly, she pushed her hands through the sand, feeling the weight of gravity shift as she rose. The world around her seemed to pause. She stood, head to toe in grit and netting, 30 meters behind their command post. It took 5 seconds for anyone to notice. Driscoll saw her first. His expression froze, disbelief turning into quiet awe. "Contact 30 meters north," Corian barked instinctively. Weapons turned. Then recognition set in. She didn't speak, just adjusted the sling on her rifle and waited. Commander Halstead approached, jaw set but eyes almost smiling. "How long have you been there, Sergeant?" 11 hours, sir." He blinked. "How close did we get?" 15 meters. 2 of your snipers set up within 30. Silence, then a low whistle from somewhere in the back. She didn't gloat, didn't grin. She just stood, letting the wind take the sand from her shoulders. For once, she didn't have to prove anything. But later, as the team packed up, she couldn't shake the thought. This wasn't victory. It was validation. And validation shouldn't have to be earned this hard. She turned toward the horizon, where the dunes met the rising sun. Somewhere out there, her uncle's voice seemed to echo through memory. "The best ones," he'd said, "are the ones nobody ever sees coming." She whispered the words back to the wind. And for the first time in a long while, she smiled. The desert was quiet again. The kind of silence that only comes after disbelief fades. They packed up the exercise site hours ago, but Kira still stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the wind erase her footprints one grain at a time. She always found something poetic in that, the way the desert never kept evidence of who walked it. Behind her, the SEALs had driven off toward base, engines rumbling into the distance, leaving nothing but tire marks that would vanish by morning. For a long moment, Kira didn't move. She just let the stillness wrap around her. Then a voice crackled through her radio. "Sergeant Westland, command requests your presence for debrief." She sighed, clipped the radio back to her vest, and started the slow walk toward the forward command tent. Her legs ached from staying still so long, but pain was just part of the job. You learn to live with it. When she entered the tent, the air inside was cooler, recycled through a humming generator. Commander Halstead stood near a table covered with maps and topographic overlays. Lieutenant Corian was there too, arms crossed, face unreadable. Halstead looked up as she stepped in. "Sergeant, hell of a performance out there." Kira gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir." "You made an entire SEAL platoon question their doctrine. That's impressive." She didn't respond. Compliments had always made her uneasy. They never lasted. Corian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You made us look like idiots out there, Westland, but I'll admit it, what you did was brilliant. His tone wasn't mocking, it was genuine. That surprised her more than anything else that day. Halstead stepped closer. We're going to debrief this formally tomorrow, but before that, I'd like to make a request. Kira waited. I want you to stay on for the next training cycle, teach your methods. We'll call it Desert Concept, your fieldcraft. The next group of operators could use what you've got. For a moment she thought she'd misheard. You want me to teach SEALs? Halstead nodded. If they're smart, they'll listen. Corian gave a wry smile, especially after what happened today. Kira looked between them. The offer should have felt like vindication. Instead, all she felt was exhaustion, the kind that came from years of proving something nobody had the right to question in the first place. She gave a simple answer, "Yes, sir, I'll stay." That night she sat outside her quarters with a canteen in hand, watching the desert glow under the moon. The dunes looked softer in the silver light, almost gentle. It reminded her of nights back on the ranch, when her uncle would build a small fire and tell stories that never had endings. He used to say, "Out here everything leaves a trace, even silence." She missed that silence now. In the military, everything was noise, orders, reports, voices fighting to be heard. You couldn't disappear even when you wanted to. When she finally went inside, she took off her boots and placed her rifle on the rack beside her bed. It wasn't the same rifle she'd used overseas, but it carried the same weight, the same memories of people she hadn't been able to save. Some nights she still saw them in her dreams. The young spotter from Mosul who joked about becoming a chef when he got home. The local interpreter who had walked into an ambush because someone misread a signal flare. Each face a scar that didn't fade. She lay back on the cot and closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come. It rarely did anymore. The debrief the next morning was quiet, efficient. The SEALs gathered around the projection screen while Kira walked them through her decisions, position selection, concealment layering, line-of-sight angles. It wasn't arrogance. It was instruction. Most people look outward when they hide, she explained, tracing the topographic lines with a laser pointer. They find cover and build around it. But concealment isn't about what you add, it's about what you remove. Shadows, contrast, rhythm. The brain looks for patterns, not shapes. Driscoll, the senior chief who'd questioned her before the exercise, leaned forward. So you're saying you use the terrain to trick our perception, not just camouflage against it. Exactly. You can't fight the land, she said. You become part of it. No one interrupted. Even the ones who doubted her before now listened like students. Afterward, Driscoll approached her privately. "Sergeant," he said, "I was wrong. I judged before I understood. You've changed how I think about reconnaissance." Kira nodded once. "Thank you, Senior Chief." He hesitated, then added softly, "I'll be passing this on to every operator I train." She appreciated that more than she showed. Apologies were rare currency in the military. Over the next weeks, Kira became something of an enigma on base. The soldiers respected her. The SEALs studied her methods. She didn't crave attention, but she earned it quietly. The new batch of trainees called her Ghost Instructor. Not to her face, but she heard it whispered in the mess hall. She didn't mind. It fit. Every morning before sunrise, she'd be out in the dunes alone, checking new positions, testing concealment patterns against shifting light. She'd sit for hours, motionless, measuring how shadows moved across her netting. Some called it obsession. She called it discipline. But beneath that discipline was something deeper, something she didn't talk about. During her second deployment, she'd lost someone, a fellow scout named Evans. They'd been running parallel observation posts in a small Afghan village. He was hit by indirect fire less than 30 meters from her position. She'd seen the flash, felt the ground shake, heard the radio cut to static. By the time she reached him, it was too late. For years, she'd carried that sound in her mind, the silence after the explosion. Now every time she lay in a hide, that silence returned. She told herself she was training others so they'd never make the same mistakes. But deep down, she knew she was still trying to atone for one she couldn't prevent. One evening, near the end of her second week as instructor, Halstead found her sitting on a dune after hours. The sun was sinking low, throwing long shadows across the sand. He sat down beside her without a word. For a while, they both just watched the light fade. "You ever think about getting out?" he finally asked. She smirked slightly. "You mean leaving the army?" "Yeah, after what you pulled here, you could write your own ticket. Instructor programs, defense contracts, even special projects. You've got options." She didn't answer right away. "I used to think about it, but out here it's quiet, and I think better in the quiet." Halstead nodded. "Fair." He hesitated, then said, "For what it's worth, you've changed a lot of minds here, mine included." Kira looked at him, trying to read if he meant it. He did. "I didn't come here to change minds," she said softly. "I just came to do my job." "Maybe," Halstead replied, "but sometimes doing the job right is what changes minds." He stood, brushed sand from his uniform, and left her with that thought. She watched him go, then turned back toward the horizon. The wind picked up again, and she pulled her scarf tighter around her face. In that moment, she realized something she hadn't felt in years, something close to belonging. Not because they accepted her, but because she no longer needed them to. The next morning, a new exercise began. This time, Kira was the observer, not the hunted. The SEAL trainees were attempting to replicate her methods. She watched through binoculars from a distant ridge as they dug into the sand. They were good, careful, focused. But they still made one mistake: impatience. She could see their movements from a kilometer away, subtle but visible. Tiny shifts of weight, unnecessary adjustments. The kind of things you only notice if you've spent years learning how not to move. She keyed her radio. "Alpha team, freeze. You're breathing through your shoulders again. It's visible from here." A pause, then a flustered voice came through. "Ma'am, how can you even see that?" She smiled faintly. "Because I used to make the same mistake." That night she returned to her quarters later than usual. The air smelled like rain, a rare gift in the desert. She stood outside, letting the first drops hit her face. Inside, she opened the old duffel she kept under her bunk. Beneath spare uniforms was a folded letter, yellowed, worn at the creases, her uncle's handwriting. She hadn't read it in years. "Kira, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Don't let this world harden you so much that you stop feeling the wind. The land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. That's where strength comes from, quiet strength. The kind that doesn't shout to be seen." She ran her fingers over the ink, tears welling up before she could stop them. For all the camouflage and distance, she realized she'd spent her whole life hiding from something inside herself. The need to be seen for who she truly was, not just what she could do. She folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the bag. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "I haven't stopped feeling the wind, Uncle. Not yet." The following week, her teaching became different, softer, more human. When she spoke to trainees now, she didn't just talk about tactics. She talked about patience, about fear, about what it meant to be alone for hours with nothing but your thoughts. "Camouflage hides the body," she told them one morning, "but discipline hides the doubt. And doubt," she paused, "is what gets people killed." Some of them didn't understand right away. But the ones who'd seen combat, who'd felt that quiet dread of waiting for something that might never come, they did. They nodded silently. And for the first time since arriving at Yuma, Kira felt something shift. Not in the desert, in herself. The stillness she used to hide behind had started to turn into peace. That night, as she walked back to her quarters under a vast, star-swept sky, she paused at the crest of a dune and looked back. The training area stretched for miles, quiet, empty, beautiful. The same ground that once tested her now felt like home. She thought of all the times she'd been told she didn't belong, and for once, she didn't need to prove them wrong. Because she already had. And maybe she thought that was the real victory, learning that strength doesn't roar, it whispers. The call came just after dawn. Kira was standing by the firing range, watching the horizon bleed orange, when her radio buzzed with the clipped, urgent tone she hadn't heard since deployment days. Sergeant Westland, report to command, priority briefing. Her chest tightened before her mind caught up. The last time she'd heard those words, someone hadn't come back. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and started walking, boots crunching through coarse sand. The air felt heavier that morning, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Inside the command tent, the mood was different. The chatter was gone. The usual confidence in the SEAL operators was replaced by a subtle edge, anticipation mixed with unease. Commander Halstead stood at the front, flanked by two men in plain clothes, intelligence officers. That was never a good sign. Kira saluted quietly, and Halstead motioned her forward. Sergeant, you're familiar with current test operations, but this is something else. Classified, off-record. She waited. He nodded to one of the intel officers. The man stepped forward, dropping a tablet on the table and tapping the screen. A satellite image appeared, rugged terrain, not desert this time. Mountains. This is southeastern Syria, he said. Our drone surveillance picked up irregular movement near an old compound outside Deir ez-Zor. We believe a small extremist cell has taken up residence. Intelligence suggests possible hostage activity. Kira frowned. And where do I fit in? Halstead folded his arms. We've been asked to provide observation support for a potential rescue op. They need someone who can establish forward overwatch and feed live intel back to the team. Her eyes lifted from the map to his face. You want me to go back out? Halstead's expression was steady. You're the best we've got for this environment. Low visibility, minimal support, uncertain enemy strength. It's not a test, Sergeant, it's the real thing. The silence stretched. She hadn't deployed in almost 2 years. Yuma had become her sanctuary, the one place where the noise of war couldn't reach her, and now it was calling her back. She exhaled slowly. When? Wheels up in 6 hours. The transport plane's engines roared into the night. Kira sat strapped in near the rear, her gear bag between her boots, helmet resting on her knee. Around her, a small detachment of SEALs prepped in silence, checking weapons, syncing radios, tightening straps. The kind of quiet that only came from people who'd been there before. Corian was among them. He gave her a brief nod when their eyes met. No words, just acknowledgement. The air smelled like fuel and cold metal. It brought back too many memories. The tremor of anticipation before contact. The taste of adrenaline that never quite left your mouth. As the plane lifted into the dark, she closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. She told herself this was just another mission. Observation, not engagement. Simple. But deep down, she knew better. Nothing about returning to the field was ever simple. They touched down on a forward operating strip near the Iraqi border before dawn. The desert here was harsher, darker. The sand carried the scent of oil and cordite. In the operations tent, Corian briefed the team. Target compound here, he said, pointing to a series of low structures on a digital map. We insert from the south, establish 2 observation posts, confirm hostage presence, and wait for green light from command. Westland, you'll set up overwatch on this ridge. He pointed to a contour line, overlooking the compound's northern wall. 2 clicks out. You'll have visibility over the whole perimeter. We'll feed your intel through encrypted channel Bravo. Kira studied the image. The layout reminded her of too many old missions. Same tension between exposure and cover. Same narrow margin for error. Extraction plan, she asked. Corian hesitated. Still pending, depends on confirmation. That told her everything. They didn't know how this was going to end. She nodded anyway, understood. The insertion began at 200. The world was ink black except for the faint glow of infrared strobes. The helicopter flew low, skimming over the terrain before dropping them a kilometer from their observation zones. The rotor wash kicked up a cloud of dust that clung to everything. Kira hit the ground hard, rolled, then crouched. Her breathing steadied automatically. Every muscle remembered what to do, even if her heart didn't. The SEAL team split into two fire elements moving south. Kira went alone toward the ridge. Her footsteps were slow, measured. The sand crunched softly under her boots. The silence felt alive again, like the land itself was watching. By the time she reached her position, the horizon had begun to glow faintly with pre-dawn light. She settled behind a rock outcrop, unpacking her gear, optic, radio, notepad, rifle. The routine felt like muscle memory, familiar, comforting even. Through her scope, she could see the compound clearly now. 3 main buildings, a small courtyard, 2 vehicles parked near a gate. No visible movement yet. She keyed her radio. Overwatch set, visual on compound. Corian's voice came back low and steady. Copy Ghost, hold position. Ghost, they still called her that. Hours passed. The world moved in slow motion. A lone dog barked in the distance. A dust devil twisted across the horizon. She tracked faint heat signatures through her thermal, counting 4, then 5, then 7. 2 were armed. The rest she couldn't tell. Her pen moved silently across the notepad, recording times, patterns, packing. Every detail mattered. But even as her focus narrowed, something else began to stir inside her, a creeping unease she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, it was memory. The way the compound looked under faint light, it reminded her of that place outside Sangin. The night Evans died, the same crumbling walls, the same stillness before everything went wrong. She blinked hard, shaking off the image, but it didn't fade. When the first radio call came, it startled her. Overwatch, confirmed visual on hostages. She adjusted her scope, zoomed in. A movement, 2 figures, hands bound, led across the courtyard. One stumbled. A guard shoved them forward. Affirmative, she whispered. 2 hostages confirmed. Male, adult, movement restricted, moderate guard presence. Copy, stand by for breach order. She switched to observation mode, recording patterns, but her thoughts were drifting again to the feeling of helplessness. Watching, always watching, never intervening until it was too late. In Afghanistan, she'd been the unseen eyes that called in fire missions from miles away. She'd saved lives with her precision, but she'd also seen what those decisions cost. You never forget what collateral damage looks like when it's close enough to smell. And now, once again, she was the unseen observer, the silent witness. The operation unfolded with textbook precision. When the breach order came, the SEAL teams moved fast. 2 squads from the south wall, synchronized entry. Muffled pops of suppressed gunfire echoed through the valley. Kira tracked movement through her scope, updating positions in real time. Team 1 inside, clearing structure Alpha. Team 2, contact in the courtyard. Her pulse was steady, but her fingers trembled slightly. She told herself it was the cold. Then something changed. A flash north wall, a shadow where none should be. Corian, be advised, unknown movement on your 9 o'clock. Possible overwatch from external ridge, 200 meters west. Static crackled, then copy Ghost, can you identify? Before she could answer, the ridge lit up. A tracer round cut through the darkness, striking the compound wall with a violent crack. Another followed, then another. Sniper fire, West Ridge. The world erupted into chaos. Kira spun her rifle, locating the shooter. Her scope found the glint instantly, A muzzle flash behind a small cluster of rocks. Elevation. Advantage. Whoever it was, they'd planned this. She exhaled slowly, letting her mind narrow. Time slowed. Wind direction 2 knots east. Range 340 meters, adjust elevation. The shooter fired again. She saw the puff of dust, heard the echo a second later, too close to Corian's team. Her finger rested on the trigger, breath held. For a moment, all she saw was Evans. The same ridge, the same flash. She blinked, heart pounding. "Kira, take the shot," Corian's voice snapped through comms. She steadied, aligned crosshairs, exhaled halfway. Then squeeze. The rifle kicked once, muzzle smoke drifted sideways. Through the scope, she saw the shooter collapse forward, motionless. Silence. Then Corian's voice again, calm but strained. "Target neutralized, compound secure, hostages recovered." Kira didn't answer. She just lowered her rifle and stared at the lifeless figure on the ridge. The wind tugged at the body's sleeve, lifting dust into the air. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt nothing. By the time they exfiltrated, the sun had risen high. The light was harsh, bleaching the world in white. In the transport back, no one spoke. The rescued hostages sat quietly, trembling, wrapped in thermal blankets. Corian sat across from her, his expression unreadable. When the plane finally leveled off, he leaned forward slightly. "That was clean work back there, saved lives." She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "Doesn't feel clean." He didn't press, he knew better. Back at base, the debrief was short. Success. 2 hostages recovered, 0 friendly casualties, 1 hostile sniper neutralized. The kind of after-action report that looked perfect on paper. But later that night, when Kira sat alone in her quarters, she opened her field notes and stared at the timestamp next to her shot. 340 meters. 1 round. Confirmed hit. Her handwriting looked steady. Her pulse hadn't been. She thought of the shooter, whoever they'd been. Maybe just another trained ghost like her, following orders, believing in their side of the story. Maybe they weren't that different. She closed the notebook and whispered to the dark, "Sometimes, I think we're just reflections on opposite hills." The desert wind pressed gently against the window, carrying the faint sound of sand against glass. Outside, the night was endless. And somewhere in that silence, Kira realized that no matter how many times she proved herself, the one person she still needed to forgive was the one in her own reflection. She lay back, eyes open to the ceiling, replaying her uncle's voice in memory. Strength isn't about surviving the shot. It's about surviving the silence that follows. And as the lights flickered out, she finally understood what he meant. The applause bothered her more than the silence ever had. It wasn't real applause, not clapping hands, not cheering, but the quiet kind, the one that came through nods, through handshakes, through briefings labeled commendable performance. They called it a flawless operation. In every report, her name sat cleanly between statistics. 1 hostile sniper neutralized, 2 hostages extracted, no casualties, mission success. She should have been proud. But the moment she saw the words "target neutralized," something in her chest went cold. She remembered the stillness after her shot, how the man on the ridge hadn't even twitched, just folded like gravity had remembered him too suddenly. That stillness stayed with her. The others had moved on, she couldn't. At Yuma, she returned to the rhythm of training, teaching concealment, refining doctrine, smiling when people called her a legend. But the quiet felt different now, heavier. Every morning she'd walk out to the dunes before sunrise. The same dunes where she'd once hidden, once proven herself. But lately, they felt like graves, each hollow in the sand, another memory buried, another piece of herself she didn't want to find. She'd kneel, close her eyes, listen to the wind move through the ridges. For a few seconds it felt peaceful. Then, inevitably, the wind would shift and she'd hear it again, the echo of that shot, faint but endless. Sometimes she whispered into the empty desert, "Was it worth it?" No answer ever came. The nightmares returned first. They weren't vivid, not at first, just fragments. A glint of sunlight, the smell of gun oil, the weight of her rifle pressing against her shoulder. Then faces began to appear, people she'd known, people she'd lost. Evans, the spotter, her uncle, even the man she'd shot on the ridge. They never spoke. They just looked at her. Sometimes in the dreams they traded places. One moment Evans was lying in the dust. The next, it was her. She'd wake drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling, counting her breaths until her pulse slowed. Then she'd get up before dawn, as if running from something that waited just behind her eyes. One afternoon, Commander Halstead found her on the observation range, lying prone behind a row of targets. She'd been there for hours, adjusting her rifle between drills, firing without pause. He stood behind her, watching quietly. When she finally noticed him, she didn't turn. "Something wrong, sir?" "No," he said, "just wondering if you ever stop training." She exhaled slowly. "If I stop moving, I start thinking." Halstead walked closer, crouched beside her. "You know, there's a difference between discipline and penance." She looked at him, eyes tired. "Is there?" He studied her face, then said softly, "You did good work out there, Sergeant. You saved people." She rolled her cheek against the stock of her rifle, aligning another shot. "Maybe, but someone didn't go home because I did." He sighed. "That's war." She fired again. The bullet split the target cleanly through the center. "That's the excuse." Halstead didn't respond. He knew when to stop talking. He stood, brushing dust off his knee. "Debrief tomorrow at 09, be there." When he left, she stayed prone, staring through her scope at the hole she'd made. A perfect shot, precise, controlled, surgical. And for the first time, it didn't feel like mastery. It felt like guilt. The next day's debrief was short, routine. Her report from Syria was officially closed, commendations pending. But when she tried to leave, a voice stopped her. "Sergeant Westland," said a man she didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, gray hair, eyes like he'd read too many secrets. "Mind if we talk a moment?" She hesitated. "Who are you?" He smiled faintly. "You could say I'm with Operations Development. We monitor personnel with exceptional field adaptability." Kira didn't answer. He continued, "Your methods in desert concealment have caught attention beyond this base. We're assembling a small evaluation group for special reconnaissance doctrine. We'd like you to consult." "Another training program?" "Not exactly. More like a hybrid field unit. Low profile, advisory role, you choose your assignments." She studied him. "Why me?" He held her gaze. "Because you see things most people miss, and because you don't flinch." She didn't like how easily he said it, as if detachment were a skill, not a scar. "I'll think about it," she said finally. He nodded as though he already knew she would. "You've got 48 hours." When he left, Halstead stepped out from his office. "They came for you, didn't they?" Kira shrugged. "They came for a name." He gave a small, sad smile. "Same thing these days." That night she didn't sleep. She sat at her desk, letter from her uncle laid open beside a half-empty mug of coffee. The ink had faded, but the words hadn't. "The world will try to turn patience into punishment. Don't let it." She read it 3 times, then again. The truth was, she didn't know if she could go back into the field, not because she feared dying, but because she feared feeling nothing when it happened again. She thought about the man on the ridge, about how easily her hands had moved, about how quiet the world had gone afterward. There was a time when that quiet had been peace. Now it was punishment. The following morning, she found herself in the vehicle bay, watching the SEAL trainees load their gear for another desert exercise. Driscoll caught sight of her and waved. You're not joining us. Not today. He nodded, tightening the strap on his pack. Heard about your Syria mission. Hell of a job. She forced a polite smile. That's what they tell me. He hesitated, then said, You know, people here talk about you like you're untouchable. But I don't think that's true. You just disappear where others don't. Kira tilted her head. That a compliment? Maybe a warning, he said. Be careful not to disappear too far. Then he was gone, leaving her with the echo of words she couldn't ignore. Later that day, Halstead called her back into his office. The same gray-suited man was there again, waiting, hands folded on the table. Halstead motioned for her to sit. Before you decide, I wanted you to hear the details directly. The man nodded. We're calling it Operation Glasslight, classified beyond Yuma's scope. Multi-branch coordination. We're forming a covert observation unit to monitor unconventional combat activity in contested regions, places where regular forces can't go without starting headlines. You'd lead the recon component. Kira leaned back, crossing her arms. And what happens when we find something? That depends on what you find, he said evenly. You'd report, assess, and advise. Engagement only if necessary. Engagement always becomes necessary, she said quietly. He didn't deny it. Halstead spoke up. You don't have to say yes, you've earned your peace here. She looked between them. Peace. It sounded so simple when other people said it. Finally she asked, why now? The man's answer was immediate. Because the world's getting harder to see clearly, and we need people who still can. She thought about that long after they left. That night she walked to the top of the highest dune behind the base. The stars above were sharp and endless. The desert wind moved softly, carrying fragments of old echoes, rifle shots, laughter, cries, all of it blending into the hum of distance. She sat down, burying her hands in the sand. It was cold tonight, not the kind of cold that hurts, the kind that reminds you you're still alive. She thought about her uncle's letter again, about Evans, about the man on the ridge, about every ghost that lived quietly between her ribs. The world kept asking her to disappear, to become invisible for the sake of missions, of doctrine, of balance. And she kept doing it because that's what she was good at. But she was starting to wonder if she'd hidden for so long that she no longer remembered what it felt like to be seen. Somewhere below, she could see the lights of the base, small, flickering, fragile. She whispered to herself, how many times do you vanish before you stop coming back? The wind didn't answer, but it moved, and that was enough. When dawn came, she made her choice. In Halstead's office, she stood straight, hands behind her back. I'll take the assignment, she said. Halstead's face was calm but not without concern. You sure? No, she said, but I'm ready. He nodded once, understanding more than he said. Then I'll sign off. Deployment briefing in 72 hours. As she turned to leave, he added quietly, Don't forget who you are out there, Kira. She paused at the door. That's the part I'm still figuring out, sir. Outside, the sun was already high, burning the air until it shimmered. She walked toward the range one last time, picked up her rifle, settled behind it. Through the scope, the world looked small again, controlled, predictable. But when she lowered it, everything felt too big. She took a slow breath and said to the desert, one more mission. The sand shifted under her knees, whispering softly, as if agreeing, as if warning. And in that fragile moment between certainty and doubt, Kira Westland felt both exactly where she belonged and nowhere at all. The desert looked different from the air at night. Not vast, endless. Like the world itself had forgotten where it ended. Kira sat beside the cabin window of the C-130, the faint green glow of her tablet lighting her face. Lines of satellite imagery scrolled past her eyes, topography, movement grids, thermal outlines. She didn't blink often. The longer she looked, the more the desert seemed alive, shifting, breathing, hiding. Operation Glasslight wasn't a rumor anymore. It was real, and it was already in motion. They'd given her a team. Not soldiers, not exactly. A mix of intelligence analysts, recon specialists, and a quiet technical officer named Rafik Morales who spoke 5 languages and never raised his voice. Their orders were simple on paper: observe, document, verify. But everyone knew those words were just a curtain. Observation turns into engagement when you stare long enough, Morales had said on the flight. His tone wasn't cynical, just factual. Kira had nodded, though she'd been thinking the same thing. The forward base sat at the edge of nowhere, an unmarked cluster of tents and steel containers buried between ridgelines of black rock. Even the wind seemed cautious here. Inside the operations tent, the mission brief glowed on a portable hollow screen. A man from intelligence, different face, same quiet confidence, outlined the objective. Unregistered armed group operating along the Jordanian border. Reports of cross-movement, potential trafficking. We don't engage unless provoked. Your job is pattern identification, infiltration mapping, and real-time comms relay. He pointed to a blurred image of vehicles clustered around a canyon road. We don't know who they're working for. That's what you're here to find out. Kira listened, arms folded. When the briefing ended, she asked only one question. Rules of engagement. The man hesitated. Self-defense only, but we trust your judgment. She hated that phrase, trust your judgment. It always meant we'll blame you if it goes wrong. After the meeting, Morales caught up with her outside. You look like you've done this before. She gave a faint smile, too many times. Still volunteered. Habit. He studied her a moment, or guilt. She didn't answer. Their first mission came 48 hours later. They moved at dusk, 2 vehicles, low signature convoy, no identifiers. The terrain was rough, all jagged stone and long shadows. Their target was a canyon overlook 5 kilometers from the suspected camp. Kira's role, overwatch and coordination. She modified her hide kit again, lighter mesh, heat-dampening weave, new texture blend she'd designed herself. She could disappear faster than thought now. By the time the team established their listening post, night had fallen completely. The air smelled of dust and diesel. From her position on the ridge, Kira could see faint lights flickering below, campfires, maybe, or torches. Through her scope, figures moved between trucks, too far for ID. She keyed her mic. Visual contact, 10, maybe 12 personnel, no heavy weapons visible. Morales's voice came back, calm and measured. Copy, Ghost, keep eyes on. She shifted slightly, letting the rifle rest against the rock, scanning patterns of movement. There was rhythm to it, guard rotations, supply runs, sentries talking in short bursts. It reminded her, uncomfortably, of her own team back in Syria. At 200, a vehicle arrived unmarked, headlights off. 3 men stepped out, one carrying a metallic case. They disappeared into a tent. Kira zoomed in, watching the flap lift for a second. The man inside looked older, military posture, deliberate movements. Not a local militia leader, someone trained. She whispered into comms, possible foreign liaison, recording. Copy, Morales said, don't lose eyes. She didn't, not for the next 6 hours. By dawn, her back ached and her eyes burned, but she stayed focused. When the camp began to stir, she logged every vehicle leaving, every face that looked important. When Morales finally said, "Pack it, Ghost, we've got enough," she realized her hands were trembling. Not from fatigue, from restraint. The urge to act, to do something, had become unbearable. She'd spent her life being invisible, but now invisibility felt like complicity. The debrief back at base was quick, clinical. Data logged, patterns confirmed. Command approved Phase 2, shadow surveillance on the vehicles leaving the camp. Morales caught her afterward, handing her a tin mug of bitter coffee. You ever get tired of just watching? Always. So why keep doing it? She stared into the cup. Because someone has to, and because if the wrong people watch instead, it costs lives. He smiled sadly. Sounds like justification. It is, she said, but it's the only one that keeps me sane. Days blurred together, missions stacked, each one more complex, more secretive. The team grew quieter, their eyes darker. There were no medals here, no public briefings, no headlines, just coordinates and shadows. Kira began keeping notes again, not the tactical kind, but personal. Pages filled with sentences that started but never finished, thoughts she couldn't say aloud. If the world runs on ghosts, what happens when ghosts start believing they're alive? Sometimes she wondered if she'd crossed a line without noticing. On the fifth mission, everything changed. They'd been tracking a convoy through a dry riverbed near the border when their drone feed cut out. Static, then silence. Kira was in the Overwatch vehicle with Morales, scanning the horizon through her optic. Signals jammed, Morales muttered. They've got counter-surveillance. Before she could reply, a flash bloomed across the valley, an explosion that threw a column of dust into the sky. Ambush, someone yelled over comms. Kira grabbed her rifle, opening the door. Positions, Morales, stay low. She sprinted toward the ridge, dropping behind a rock formation. Through her scope, she saw their lead vehicle disabled, smoke pouring from the engine. Two of her teammates were pinned down behind it, returning fire. "Command, this is Glasslight 1, she said sharply. "We're engaged, grid reference Delta 93. Request support." Static, no response. Another explosion shook the valley. Debris rained across the sand. She switched channels. Morale's status. His voice came back broken. "Radio's fried, we're blind." She inhaled slowly, mind clearing the way it always did under fire. Distance, 420 meters. Crosswind minimal. Targets, 3 moving. She sighted the first, exhaled, fired. One down. The second darted behind a truck. She adjusted tracking movement, fired again, missed, fired again. The man fell. The third vanished. "Kira, move," Morales shouted. She rolled to a new position just as a round slammed into the rock where her head had been. Dust stung her eyes. She didn't feel fear, only precision. When the final shot came, it wasn't hers. The gunfire stopped. The valley went silent. She waited a full minute before moving. Then she stood, checked her surroundings, and radioed again. "Area secure. Multiple hostiles down. Glasslight team holding position." Still no response from command, only the empty wind. They recovered 3 bodies from the opposing side. 2 wore militia fatigues. 1 didn't. Civilian clothes, tactical boots, expensive watch. Morales crouched beside the body, frowning. "This one doesn't belong here." Kira knelt, brushing dust from the man's face. He was young, early 20s maybe, clean-shaven, too clean. "What do you think?" Morales asked quietly. She shook her head. "Contractor, maybe intel." He looked at her. "Hours." She didn't answer. They loaded the bodies onto a tarp. Later that night, command retrieved them without comment. No questions, no paperwork. By morning, it was as if the firefight had never happened. But the silence afterward, that was the loudest thing of all. Kira spent the next day alone. She cleaned her rifle 3 times, replayed every shot in her head. Morales found her in the tent, staring at the weapon like it might answer her. "You did what you had to," he said gently. "Did I?" He sat across from her. "If you hadn't, we'd be dead." "That's not the part I'm questioning." He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "You think the kid was one of ours." She didn't deny it. Morales rubbed his temples. "They'll bury it, they always do." "Doesn't mean I should." He sighed. "You can't carry every ghost, Kira." She looked at him, voice soft. "They carry me." That night she couldn't sleep. She walked outside the perimeter fence into the open desert. The moon hung low, huge and white. She took off her gloves, letting sand sift through her fingers. It was cool, dry, endless. She thought of the young man's face, the surprise frozen in his eyes. She thought of the phrase self-defense only. She thought of how easy it had been to squeeze the trigger again. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: fear. Not of dying, of becoming numb. She whispered into the dark, "What if the thing I'm best at is the thing that's killing me?" The wind answered in a low hum, almost like breath. She closed her eyes, remembering her uncle's words. "The land doesn't belong to us, we belong to it." Maybe that was why she kept returning, not to serve, but to dissolve. To let the desert take her piece by piece, until nothing hurt anymore. At dawn, Morales found her still sitting there, sand covering her boots. "You didn't come back last night," he said quietly. She looked at him, eyes rimmed red. "No reason to." He crouched beside her. "You can't disappear on me, ghost." She smiled faintly. "Too late, I already have." He shook his head. "You haven't, not yet." She stood slowly, dusting off her hands. "Tell command I'm requesting transfer. Observer only. No engagement authority." "You think they'll approve that?" "No," she said, "but they'll try to justify why they won't, and maybe that'll make them think." Morales exhaled, half a laugh, half despair. "You're a strange kind of soldier, Westland." "Maybe I stopped being one." Back at the ridge later that day, she unpacked her notebook again. This time she didn't write coordinates or tactics. She wrote words she'd never said aloud. "I thought disappearing would save me. It didn't. It only made it easier for the world to forget what it was doing." She closed the book and looked out at the endless horizon. The dunes shimmered under the rising sun, soft, golden, merciless. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She just felt tired. The kind of tired that comes when you realize you've become the thing you once hunted, a shadow with perfect aim. She whispered, "Maybe strength isn't surviving the silence. Maybe it's learning how to break it." Then she stood, slung her rifle across her shoulder, and began walking back toward the base, her footprints fading behind her almost immediately. The desert kept her secrets, but it also remembered. The report landed on a desk somewhere in Washington, red-stamped and sanitized. "Contact with unidentified hostiles. Engagement necessary. Mission successful." Kira knew the wording by heart before she even saw it. Every story she'd ever lived eventually ended that way, washed clean until the truth couldn't breathe. At the forward base, the world kept spinning as if nothing had cracked. Generators hummed, radios hissed, people laughed at breakfast. Only she moved through it like a ghost who still hadn't decided whether to haunt or to leave. Morales noticed first. "You're quieter than usual," he said, setting 2 tin mugs of coffee on her table. She gave him a thin smile. "That's impressive, Morales. Not many people can detect silence." He sat opposite her. "You filed the incident report." "Command filed it for me." "And they left out the civilian." Her eyes lifted, sharp. "He's not a civilian anymore, he's classified." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. She pushed the coffee aside, the steam twisting like smoke from a memory she couldn't extinguish. For years she'd believed invisibility was armor. Now it felt like evidence. By noon she was summoned to the ops tent. 2 officers waited, Halstead, and a stranger in a black windbreaker with no insignia. His haircut screamed government, his posture screamed control. "Kira Westland," he said without introduction. "You've been cited for exemplary restraint under fire. Commands pleased." She didn't reply. The man smiled faintly. "But we're concerned about inconsistencies in your debrief. You wrote that engagement was ambiguous. Care to clarify?" She met his eyes. One of the hostiles might have been friendly. "Might," he repeated. "You're not certain." "No," she said. Because the scene was cleared before I could confirm. He studied her face, looking for weakness. Sergeant, our job isn't to moralize, it's to provide clarity for policy. Your hesitation complicates that. Kira leaned forward slightly. Maybe policy needs complications. The room went still. Even Halstead looked uneasy. The man's smile didn't move. Noted, dismissed. Outside, the wind hit her face like a slap. For the first time since joining Glasslight, she felt the line between soldier and conscience start to tear. That evening she walked the perimeter alone. The desert around the base was endless again. Black sky, silver dunes, the faint whine of wind against wire. She stopped near the northern fence, crouched, and pressed her palm to the sand. Cold, still, honest. The earth never lied, it simply remembered. She whispered to it, "Tell me what I'm doing." The answer came only as a breath of wind that scattered her words. Behind her, boots crunched. Morales approached slowly, hands in his jacket. "Thought I'd find you here." "Can't sleep," she said. "None of us can," he hesitated. "You planning to quit?" "Would it change anything if I did?" "Maybe not the world," he said, "but maybe you." She looked up at him. "You ever wonder what happens when people like us start believing the briefings instead of what we see?" He nodded. "That's when we stop being dangerous." She almost smiled. Maybe it's time to be dangerous then. The next morning, she made herself dangerous. At 500, she walked straight into the comms hub, a converted cargo container lined with monitors and encryption gear. Morales followed, carrying a tablet. "What's the plan, Ghost?" "Proof," she said. "If they're burying something, we dig it up." She started pulling data logs, transmission timestamps, signal intercepts, drone telemetry. Most of it was locked behind clearance codes she wasn't supposed to have, but Glasslight had taught her a few tricks. Within minutes, lines of code filled the screen. Morales whistled softly. "You realize this is career suicide. Then we'll die honest." When she opened the comms archive from the night of the ambush, the truth bled through the encryption like light through cracks. There it was, a secondary transmission, routed from an American relay point to the opposing ridge minutes before the firefight began. A call sign she recognized, Aries Red. Her pulse slowed. "They fed our position," she whispered. Morales leaned closer. "Someone tipped them off." "Not someone," she said. "Command." For a long time neither spoke. Outside, the sun was rising, harsh, white, indifferent. Finally Morales said, "What now?" Kira closed the file and slipped a drive into her pocket. "Now we see how far they're willing to lie." She went to Halstead first. He was in his office, reading reports, exhaustion carved into his face. When she entered, he didn't look up. "If this is about the inquiry." "It's about the truth," she said, placing the drive on his desk. He stared at it. "What is this?" "Proof that we weren't ambushed, we were bait." His jaw tightened. "You can't prove intent." "I can prove the transmission." Halstead rubbed his temples. "Kira, you don't understand how these operations work." "Then explain it." He exhaled. "Sometimes leaks are engineered to test response times, verify protocol adherence. By sacrificing your own." He didn't answer. She took a step closer, voice shaking now. "You let them die to measure efficiency." Halstead's eyes hardened. "I follow orders, so do you." Kira felt something fracture inside her, quietly, cleanly. She picked up the drive. "Not anymore." She walked out before he could reply. By afternoon, rumors were spreading. Someone had breached secure channels. Someone had gone rogue. Morales found her loading a small pack near the vehicle bay. "You're leaving." "Temporarily." "Where?" "Nearest relay station. I'm getting this out before they erase it." He looked at her, torn between fear and admiration. You'll make enemies. She slung her rifle across her back. I already have. He grabbed her arm. Then at least let me drive. They left at dusk, following an old supply route through the canyon. The air shimmered with heat, even after sunset. For a while neither spoke. The hum of the engine filled the silence. Finally, Morales said, "You ever think maybe we're chasing ghosts, that no one cares enough to listen?" Kira watched the horizon darken. Maybe, but ghosts don't chase for applause, they chase because they can't rest. He nodded slowly. You really believe exposing this will change something? She hesitated. I believe lies spread faster in silence. If I can make one person hesitate before pulling another trigger, maybe that's enough. He smiled, sad and proud at once. You sound like someone who's done hiding. She stared ahead. Maybe I am. They reached the relay outpost just before midnight, a small compound of antennas and floodlights against the black sky. Kira parked the vehicle behind a ridge and scanned through her optic. 2 guards, minimal rotation, no alarms. Stay here, she told Morales. Not a chance. Then keep the engine running. She slipped into the shadows, moving like smoke. Every step was memory, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yuma. Different sand, same silence. Within minutes she was inside the comms building. The hum of machines filled the air. She found the terminal, plugged in the drive and began the upload. Data flickered across the screen, proof, spilling into the ether. Then a voice behind her, don't. She froze. Halstead stood in the doorway, sidearm drawn but lowered. His eyes weren't angry, they were tired. I knew you'd come here, he said. You think you're the first to see through it. She turned slowly. Then why stay silent? Because the system eats truth for breakfast, he said softly. You can scream all you want, and by morning they'll call it classified. She took a step toward him. Maybe, but someone has to scream anyway. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, 2 ghosts on opposite sides of the same war. Then he lowered his weapon. You've got 5 minutes before they trace this. Make it count. She blinked, surprised. Why? Because I'm tired of silence too. He turned and walked out without another word. Kira hit send. The progress bar crawled upward, 60, 80, 100%. Transmission complete. She pulled the drive, heart hammering. Outside, headlights flared, Morales waving frantically. We've got company. She sprinted for the vehicle. The moment she jumped in, he gunned the engine, tires kicking sand. Behind them, alarms began to wail. They didn't stop until dawn painted the horizon red. When the sun rose, they parked on a high plateau overlooking miles of untouched desert. The wind howled through broken rock. Kira climbed onto a ledge, looking east. Somewhere out there, data she'd stolen was already moving, an invisible ripple against an empire of secrecy. Morales joined her, breathing hard. You think it reached anyone? Someone will see it, she said, even if they pretend they didn't. He nodded, quiet. What now? She looked at the endless dunes. Now we wait for the echo. Hours passed. The world didn't end. No helicopters, no orders, just the sun, the wind, and a fragile sense of relief. But deep inside, Kira knew this wasn't victory. It was exposure. Every truth came with a target. She glanced at Morales. You could still walk away. He smirked and missed the sequel. They laughed, small, exhausted, human. Then softly she said, You ever wonder if dignity speaks? He frowned. What do you mean? She looked back at the horizon. Maybe it does, maybe it just acts. He followed her gaze. So what now, ghost? Kira smiled faintly. Now we find out what being seen feels like. The wind rose again, carrying their footprints away as quickly as they made them. 2 figures standing in an ocean of sand, neither hero nor traitor, just witnesses who refused to stay invisible. And somewhere far beyond the desert, A server lit up with her name. By the second night, the wind carried news faster than radio waves. Someone somewhere had published fragments of Glasslight's transmissions. Not everything, just enough. Encrypted coordinates, redacted names, mission timestamps stripped of context but heavy with implication. Within hours, the ripples reached every corner of command. And within 24, those ripples turned into a hunt. Kira and Morales had vanished into the desert before the order went out. Now they lived in the in-between, too guilty for one side, too valuable for the other. They camped near a half-collapsed ruin that locals said used to be a weather station. Rusting antennas leaned like tired sentinels against a cloudless sky. At night the temperature dropped below freezing, and the silence pressed against their ribs. Morale stared into the small flame they allowed themselves. "You think they'll come tonight?" "They already have," Kira said. "They're just deciding who gets the credit." He smiled without humor. "That's comforting." She looked at him. "You could still disappear, cross south. They'll think you're dead." He shook his head. "And let you explain sarcasm to yourself for the rest of eternity. No chance." She almost laughed, almost. 3 days later they heard engines. Far off, small, disciplined patrol, not convoy. Kira doused the fire and grabbed her pack. "Move," she whispered. They climbed the ridge and flattened behind a line of boulders. Through her optic, she counted 4 vehicles kicking up trails of dust. Not military, contracted, the kind that moved between legality and denial. Her stomach turned. "Private response team," she muttered. "Means command wants distance." Morales glanced at her. "You think Halstead?" "No," she cut in. "If Halstead wanted me gone, he'd do it himself." Still, the implication hung between them. Someone higher had decided that truth cost too much. The truck slowed near the ruin, men stepping out with scanners and suppressed rifles. Kira watched, waiting for a pattern and opening. Then her radio, the old analog one she'd kept out of habit, crackled faintly. A voice low, urgent. "Ghost, if you can hear me, move east. 2 clicks. Friendly pickup, 15 minutes. She froze. "Halstead." Morales heard it too. "You trust him?" "Not completely," she said, "but I trust that he owes me one." They ran. 15 minutes in the desert feels longer than forgiveness. Each step burned, each breath scraped. But when the ridge finally broke, they saw the truck unmarked, engine idling, lights off. Halstead was behind the wheel, alone. He waved them in, eyes scanning the horizon. "Get in." They climbed inside without a word. The vehicle roared forward, swallowing the road. No one spoke until the ruin disappeared behind them. Then Kira said, "They're using contractors now." Halstead nodded. "Can't risk uniforms on record. They're calling you a data breach, not a whistleblower." Morales snorted. "Classic." Kira studied Halstead's reflection in the windshield. "Why help us?" He hesitated. "Because I read the unedited files. You weren't wrong." For a while, the only sound was the rattle of the engine and the wind slicing through cracks in the door. Finally he said, "You've started something you can't stop. The leak hit networks in London, Ankara, DC. Half the agencies are pretending they didn't see it. The other half are trying to figure out who else knows." Kira asked quietly, "And what happens when they find out it's me?" He glanced at her. "They'll call it treason first, then they'll call it necessity." She leaned her head back, eyes closing. "And then they'll forget." They reached an abandoned airstrip at dawn. Halstead parked the truck beside a rusted hangar. Inside waited an old cargo plane, patched but functional. Morales looked around. "You planning to fly this relic?" Halstead smirked. "Already fueled, coordinates set for a safe zone in Crete. From there, civilian routes, you disappear." Kira frowned. "And you?" I stay. Someone has to clean up the noise. She studied him. You'll take the fall. He shrugged. Better me than the truth. For a second she wanted to argue, but there was no argument left in her. Halstead handed her a small envelope. Inside, a contact. Independent journalist. If you ever decide to finish what you started, find her. She slipped it into her vest. Thank you. He met her gaze steady. Just don't romanticize it, Westland. Leaking truth doesn't cleanse you, it just makes you visible. She almost smiled. Maybe I'm tired of being invisible. Halstead nodded once, then turned away. Go before I change my mind. They flew low, skimming the edge of dawn. Morales sat beside her in the cockpit, hands shaking slightly on the controls. The desert stretched beneath them, endless veins of light and shadow. Kira looked out the window. Somewhere below, a convoy of contractors would reach the ruin, find empty sand and report failure. By then, she would already be a ghost in another hemisphere. Morales broke the silence. You think it matters, what we did? She turned to him. It matters to the ones who'll read it, even if they pretend it doesn't. He nodded. You really believe that? I have to. The plane rattled through turbulence. She closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine stillness that wasn't camouflage. In Crete, they landed at a deserted field used by smugglers and aid pilots alike. Halstead's contacts had arranged passage under new identities, documentation that looked too clean to trust. Morales looked at his new passport and laughed. Miguel Santiago sounds romantic. Kira glanced at hers. Clara Wells sounds like someone who writes travel blogs. They shared a quiet moment of absurdity. Then Morales said, So what's next, Clara Wells? She stared toward the sea. I don't know, maybe find that journalist, maybe disappear again. He nodded slowly. Whatever you choose, make it mean something. She looked at him. You coming? He smiled, tired but sincere. I think I've got one more flight left in me. Weeks passed. News spread in whispers, anonymous documents, intercepted communiques, maps of secret operations. No names were attached, but analysts speculated about a female insider from a joint task unit. Kira watched from a small apartment near the harbor, the sound of gulls mixing with the news feed. Her hands trembled as she muted the screen. They'd blurred her identity, but she recognized herself in every line. Morales entered holding 2 coffees. They're calling you the Mirage. She raised an eyebrow. Because I vanished. Because they can't decide if you're real. She almost laughed. That's fitting. He sat beside her. You regret it. She thought for a long time. I regret that it had to be done this way, but not that it was done. He nodded. So what now? Now I stop running. That night she walked down to the shoreline alone. The sea was calm, reflecting the moon in shards of silver. She removed her boots, stepped into the surf, and felt the cold bite at her skin. The waves didn't care who she was. They erased footprints as quickly as the desert had. She whispered to the horizon, Uncle, I think I finally understand. The land doesn't belong to us, but maybe truth does. For a long moment she just stood there, breathing salt in silence. Behind her, Morales called softly, Clara, Kira, whatever your name is now, we've got to move. She turned, smiling faintly. Yeah, but this time not to hide. At dawn, they boarded a ferry heading north. No uniforms, no insignias, just 2 people carrying invisible weight. On the deck, Morales leaned against the railing. You ever think about going home? She looked east, where the light broke across the water. Home's not a place anymore. It's whatever silence doesn't scare me. He nodded, understanding. When the coastline behind them began to fade, Kira took the envelope from her vest, the one Halstead had given her. Inside was a single name and a number. She memorized it, then let the paper drift into the sea. No more instructions, no more orders. Just a horizon and the fragile hope that truth, once spoken, might outlive the people who carried it. That evening, as the ferry cut through open water, Kira stood alone at the stern, watching the wake fade into darkness. The wind tangled her hair, and for the first time she didn't flinch when someone looked her way. She thought about the word ghost. Once it meant invisible. Now it meant free. Somewhere far behind her, the desert wind was still moving, whispering her name through dunes that remembered everything. But here, on the water, her reflection in the waves looked almost human again. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, she whispered the words that had followed her all her life, words that now finally made sense. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Rain. Not sand, not dust, not wind, rain. Kira woke to the sound of it striking the window of a small flat in Marseille. For months she'd almost forgotten what rain felt like. Now the world outside looked washed clean, as if the desert had been a long hallucination that the sky was trying to forget. She sat up slowly, hand instinctively searching for the rifle that wasn't there. The weapon was gone, the reflex was. Some ghosts live in muscle memory. A kettle hissed from the tiny stove. Morales, half awake, poured 2 mugs and handed her one. "Still dream of sand?" he asked. "Every night," she said, "but the dunes don't move anymore." He studied her face. "That good or bad?" She shrugged. "Depends on whether stillness means peace or paralysis." Outside, the harbor fog drifted through the alleys. They'd been living here under names borrowed from paperwork that no longer existed. She translated maps for a shipping firm. He fixed radios for fishermen. It was almost ordinary. Almost. The leak had done what leaks always do, ignited, burned bright, then disappeared beneath the next story. A handful of journalists had chased it for a season. A few hearings convened. No convictions. No acknowledgement. But programs were quietly restructured, budgets reassigned, doctrines rewritten with words like oversight and ethics. No one ever said her name. That was fine. Sometimes at night she'd scroll through headlines until she found phrases she recognized. Enhanced reconnaissance audit, unaccounted casualties, independent review. Each one felt like a heartbeat. Proof that something, somewhere had shifted. She told Morales once, maybe truth doesn't explode, maybe it seeps. He'd smiled. Slow leaks flood houses too. Months passed. The routine almost became normal. Morning coffee, silent walks along the pier, occasional letters from strangers written in cautious language. Some thanked her without saying why. Some asked if she was real. She never replied. One afternoon, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He made it out. No signature, no context. But she knew. Halstead. She read the sentence again and again until the words blurred. He'd survived whatever inquiry had followed, or maybe he hadn't, maybe made it out meant something else. Either way, she whispered a thank you to the air. Debt paid. By autumn, Morales started talking about leaving. South America, he said. There's work for pilots who don't ask questions. Kira listened but didn't answer. She spent too many years asking questions. Silence had become her rebellion. The night before he left, they sat on the roof watching the city lights shimmer against the rain-slick streets. "You sure you don't want to come?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "You were right once. I've done hiding, but maybe my fight isn't in the air anymore." He nodded, understanding. "You'll keep teaching." Something like that. He raised his mug. "To ghosts that learn to live." She clinked hers against his. "And to the living who still see ghosts." When he was gone, the flat felt bigger, quieter, honest. Winter came. Kira began visiting a small community center near the docks, a place that taught navigation to refugee teens. She volunteered to teach fieldcraft, not the kind that killed, but the kind that kept people alive. How to read terrain, how to move safely through unfamiliar land, how to listen to the wind. At first they were wary of her, the tall woman with the measured steps and soldier's eyes. But slowly they trusted her. And in teaching them, she started to trust herself again. One afternoon, a girl about 16 asked, "Were you ever afraid?" Kira paused, chalk in hand. "Yes," she said, "all the time, but fear isn't the enemy, silence is." The girl nodded, as if she understood more than most adults ever had. That night, Kira walked along the pier after class. The sea was restless, slapping against stone. She stopped at the edge, breathing in the salt. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still shimmered with it. She thought of all the versions of herself scattered across the years: the scout in Iraq, the instructor in Yuma, the operative in Glasslight's shadow. Each one had believed invisibility was safety. Now she knew safety was never the point. Meaning was. Her uncle's voice drifted through memory again, softer now, like wind through dry grass. "The land doesn't belong to us, we belong to it." She looked down at her reflection in the black water. For the first time, she didn't see a ghost. She saw someone still learning how to be visible without apology. Weeks later, she received another letter, this time from the journalist Halstead had mentioned. A woman named Eleni Varas. Short note, handwritten. "I've read your files, not all truths stay buried. If you're willing, there's more to tell. No address, just coordinates and a time." Old habits stirred, the instinct to vanish, to measure risk, to weigh the moral cost. But something deeper answered, curiosity, not fear. That night she packed a small bag, no weapons, no uniforms. Just notebooks, the letter, and the faded photo of her uncle she'd carried through every deployment. At dawn she boarded a train heading east. The meeting point was a hillside vineyard overlooking the sea. Eleni was waiting, camera slung around her neck, eyes clear and tired in the same way Kira's were. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Eleni said. "I wasn't sure I wouldn't," Kira replied. They walked between rows of vines, speaking quietly. Eleni had pieced together the rest: contracts, cover operations, buried audits. She didn't want confession, she wanted context. "Why you?" she asked finally. "Why risk everything?" Kira looked toward the horizon. "Because every system built on silence eventually needs someone willing to break it." Eleni nodded. "And do you believe it changed anything?" Kira smiled faintly. "Change isn't thunder, it's erosion." They sat beneath an olive tree until the light faded, recording fragments of truth the world would never hear in full. When Eleni left, she said, "I'll protect your name." Kira answered, "Don't. Let it exist quietly, that's enough." Spring returned. In the city, Kira kept teaching. Her students started calling her Captain Clara without knowing why. She never corrected them. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low over the water, she'd imagine the desert again, its endless dunes, its merciless honesty. She missed it the way you miss a scar. It hurts when you touch it, but you'd be lesser without it. And every once in a while, when she closed her eyes, she saw morals flying somewhere above a different horizon, still laughing at the absurdity of survival. She hoped he'd found peace too. On the anniversary of the Yuma exercise, the day she'd first risen from the sand, she took a train inland to a stretch of wild country that reminded her of New Mexico. She climbed a ridge at sunset, the sky bleeding gold into violet. There she placed her uncle's photo beneath a small cairn of stones. The wind moved softly around her, carrying the scent of dry grass and salt. She whispered, "You were right, Uncle. The best ones are the ones nobody sees coming." but sometimes the world needs to see them leave. She stayed until the last light faded, then started down the hill, footprints disappearing behind her. In the end, Kira Westland's story didn't end with heroics or headlines. It ended the way most real stories do, with someone choosing to live honestly, even when no one was watching. Some nights she still dreamed of dunes, of invisible ridges, of the whisper that had once guided her aim. But now when she woke, there was no panic in her chest. Only calm. She learned that silence can heal as well as hide. That truth doesn't need to shout. And that dignity, the kind forged in loneliness and loss, doesn't demand recognition. It simply acts. The sea outside her window kept breathing, endless and patient. She watched it for a long time, then whispered the last thing she ever said to the wind. "I'm not invisible anymore."